Never ask what happened in Sector Sol, the old captain said without taking his eyes off the stars. The last civilization that insisted on finding out became the reason every navigation computer in the galaxy learned to say no. The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the engines as the civilian freighter Horizon Crossing drifted through one of the busiest trade corridors in known space. Cargo ships, passenger liners, and mining barges crossed invisible highways that had connected hundreds of worlds for generations. Everything looked ordinary until the ship's navigation display flashed amber. A calm synthetic voice filled the bridge. Course adjustment complete. Restricted zone detected. Sector Sol has been permanently excluded from civilian travel. Cadet Mason Carter frowned at the glowing star map. He had graduated from the academy less than 3 weeks earlier, and this was his first assignment beyond his home system. "Captain," he asked, leaning closer to the console. "That route would save almost 43 hours. Why are we avoiding it?" Nobody answered. The veteran crew exchanged quick glances before returning to their stations. Even the normally talkative engineer suddenly found something more interesting to inspect beneath a maintenance panel. Captain Daniel Mercer rested one weathered hand on the back of his chair. His gray beard was trimmed short, and the deep lines around his eyes belonged to someone who had spent decades watching space teach expensive lessons. "How old are you, son?" he finally asked. 24. Mercer nodded slowly. "Then nobody ever taught your class about the Sol Protocol." Mason shrugged. "We covered the border conflicts, the coalition expansion, and the Orion trade crisis. I don't remember anything called the Sol Protocol." A quiet laugh escaped the captain, though there was no humor behind it. "Exactly." Mason looked around the bridge again. "So it's classified?" "No," Mercer replied. "It's remembered." Before Mason could ask another question, the ship's communications officer interrupted. "Captain, we've received another automated navigation update from Galactic Traffic Control." Mercer motioned for her to play it. The recording was short, almost painfully routine. "Attention all registered vessels. Maintain a minimum distance of 15 light-years from Sector Sol. Unauthorized entry is strongly discouraged. No escort services are available beyond the exclusion boundary." Mason blinked. "Discouraged? That's strange wording." Mercer gave a slow nod. "Because nobody has to enforce it." The young cadet studied the map again. There were no warning beacons, no military blockade, no minefields, no patrol fleets, just an empty circle surrounding one ordinary yellow star. "Who lives there now?" Mason asked. "Humans," Mercer answered. "Just humans? Just humans." Mason couldn't hide his confusion. Every history class had described humanity as practical traders, skilled engineers, reliable diplomats, and surprisingly friendly neighbors. They were respected, certainly, but feared? That made no sense. "If they're peaceful," Mason said carefully, "why does the entire galaxy stay away?" Mercer slowly stood and walked toward the panoramic viewport. Countless stars stretched endlessly before them, but his attention settled on one tiny point of light almost hidden among billions of others. "Because peace and harmless are not the same thing," he said quietly. "Most species never learned the difference until it was too late." Mason joined him at the window. "So what happened?" The captain remained silent for several long seconds. 30 years ago, he finally said, the Dravenian Empire asked that exact question. They believed Sector Sol was just another young civilization protecting its borders. They thought humans smiled because they were weak. They thought kindness meant surrender. He drew a slow breath before speaking again. By the time the galaxy understood the truth, nobody was asking why we avoided Sector Sol anymore. We were asking something else. Mason looked at him. "What?" Mercer never turned away from the distant yellow star. "How close can we get?" Without reminding humanity why they built those borders in the first place. 30 years earlier, nobody called the solar system forbidden. It was simply another growing member of the Galactic Council, a young civilization with good engineers, dependable cargo fleets, and diplomats who always seemed willing to compromise one more time. Earth exported food, industrial machinery, medical technology, and construction equipment to worlds that had never seen an ocean or breathed natural air. Human representatives smiled during negotiations, thanked everyone for their time, and usually accepted deals that other governments considered unfair. Many council delegates quietly concluded that humanity lacked ambition. Others believed humans were simply too inexperienced to understand galactic politics. Admiral Nathan Brooks knew better. Standing inside the orbital command center above Earth, he watched hundreds of friendly commercial vessels leave the planet every day. Massive cargo freighters climbed toward jump points while civilian shuttles carried families, students, and tourists across the system. It looked peaceful, but peace had taught Brooks one lesson over the course of 35 years in uniform. The safest morning could become the most dangerous afternoon if someone confused patience with weakness. A young intelligence officer stepped into the command room carrying a digital folder. "Sir, the latest survey reports just came in." Brooks accepted the file without looking up. "Anything unusual?" "Nothing that officially violates council agreements." Brooks glanced at him. "Officially?" The officer nodded. 3 long-range scientific vessels from the Dravenian Empire have requested permission to map gravitational fluctuations near the outer edge of the system. Their paperwork is perfect. "And unofficially?" The officer hesitated before answering. "Their flight paths do not match the survey requests." Brooks studied the projected star map. Thin blue lines traced the movements of the visiting ships. They were supposed to examine empty regions beyond Neptune. Instead, they had repeatedly adjusted course toward communication satellites, logistics hubs, and orbital traffic lanes before returning to their assigned routes. Each deviation was small enough to explain away as a navigation correction. Together, they formed a pattern. Brooks folded his arms. "That is not scientific research." "No, sir. It is reconnaissance." The room became quiet. Another officer finally spoke. "Should we file a formal complaint with the council?" Brooks shook his head. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because they already know exactly what those ships are doing." The younger officers exchanged confused looks. Brooks walked toward the observation window overlooking Earth. White clouds drifted across blue oceans that looked impossibly calm from orbit. "The council wants stability," he said. "The Dravenian Empire wants information. Neither side wants an argument. If we accuse them now, they will smile, apologize, and submit another flight plan tomorrow. Then what do we do?" Brooks answered without turning around. "We pay attention." 3 days later, the first official message arrived from the Dravenian diplomatic mission. It was polite, professionally written, and full of reassuring language about scientific cooperation and mutual trust. Brooks finished reading it before handing the tablet back to his communications officer. "Draft our response." "What should it say?" "Welcome to human space. Your approved survey corridor remains unchanged. Any deviation beyond authorized coordinates will be recorded." The officer looked surprised. "That is all." Brooks nodded once. "That is all." Hundreds of light years away, inside the Dravenian flagship, Fleet Director Cashin Vorin read the human response with an amused smile. "They noticed," one of his advisors observed. Vorin leaned back comfortably. "Of course they noticed. Do you believe they suspect our real objective?" Vorin chuckled softly. "They suspect everything." "Then should we stop?" Vorin looked through the bridge viewport toward the distant yellow star that marked humanity's home. "No. They filed a polite warning instead of deploying warships. That tells me exactly what I wanted to know." He handed the message back to his aide. "The humans are cautious. They are predictable. And above all, they are afraid to escalate." The first report arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Admiral Nathan Brooks was halfway through a cup of black coffee when his secure terminal chimed. Commander Rebecca Collins stepped into his office carrying a stack of printed reconnaissance images, an old habit she had never abandoned despite the galaxy's obsession with holograms. She placed the photographs across his desk one by one. At first glance, they looked harmless. Tiny survey vessels drifting through empty space. Routine sensor sweeps. Civilian navigation buoys. Brooks studied each image without speaking. Finally, he tapped one photograph with his finger. "There," he said. Collins nodded. "I knew you would see it." Every image showed the same Dravenian survey ship, but each pass brought it a little closer to Earth's communication backbone, orbital logistics hubs, and emergency response network. Nothing crossed a legal boundary. Nothing violated council regulations. Every movement was careful enough to appear accidental. Together, they painted a map no scientist would ever need. "They are measuring response times," Brooks said quietly. "Not stars." Collins folded her arms. "Do we intercept?" Brooks slowly shook his head. "No, sir. With respect, they are studying our infrastructure." I know. Then why are we letting them continue? Brooks leaned back in his chair. Because today they are watching. Tomorrow they will become confident. Confidence makes intelligent people careless. Later that afternoon, the human delegation attended a routine council session on Prime. Ambassador Laura Mitchell sat across from Fleet Director Cashin Voran during a discussion that officially concerned trade expansion. The conversation remained polite from beginning to end. Earth continues to impress us, Voran said with a pleasant smile. Your agricultural exports have stabilized food supplies across 12 frontier systems. Laura returned the smile. We are glad to help. Your transportation network is also remarkably efficient. We have been building supply chains for a long time. Voran nodded thoughtfully. Efficiency usually reflects strong organization. It usually reflects people who dislike wasting time, Laura answered. The surrounding delegates laughed softly. The exchange sounded friendly, but Laura recognized every question for what it really was. Voran was not interested in crops or cargo routes. He was measuring reactions, collecting information hidden between ordinary words. When the meeting ended, Laura walked directly into a secure communications room and opened a priority channel to Earth. Brooks appeared on the screen a few seconds later. How did it go? He asked. Exactly as expected, Laura replied. He asked about shipping. Brooks smiled faintly. He was asking about logistics. Yes. And he complimented our infrastructure. Twice. Brooks nodded. Then they are almost finished preparing. Laura frowned. Preparing for what? Brooks looked out the window behind his desk, where Earth slowly rotated beneath the station. For the mistake every empire eventually makes. 3 weeks passed. Dravenian survey ships continued operating inside their approved corridors, but the frequency of their scans increased dramatically. Long-range sensors detected encrypted bursts leaving the system every evening at exactly the same time. Intelligence analysts estimated that thousands of pages of strategic data were leaving human space every single day. Younger officers became restless. During one command briefing, Lieutenant Owen Parker finally spoke what everyone else had been thinking. Sir, if we already know they are collecting military intelligence, why do we keep pretending nothing is happening? Brooks looked around the room before answering. Because pretending is exactly what they expect from us. Owen blinked. I do not understand. Brooks stood and enlarged the system map until the yellow star at its center filled the display. The Dravians believe they are discovering our defenses. He paused just long enough for every officer in the room to focus on him. What they have never considered is a much simpler possibility. Collins looked at him carefully. Which is? Brooks allowed himself the smallest smile. That perhaps we have been deciding exactly what we wanted them to discover from the very beginning. The next 3 months were the quietest Admiral Nathan Brooks had experienced in years, and that worried him more than any emergency ever had. The Dravian survey ships stopped making obvious course corrections. They followed every approved flight path with almost perfect discipline. They submitted reports on time, responded politely to every human transmission, and behaved exactly the way responsible scientific expeditions were expected to behave. To almost everyone in the Galactic Council, it looked as though the misunderstanding had passed. Brooks knew better. Real professionals never became sloppy after being noticed. They simply became harder to notice. Inside Earth's orbital command, Commander Rebecca Collins entered the Situation Room carrying another intelligence summary. They have reduced active scans by 70%, she reported. Brooks looked up from a maintenance budget he had been reviewing. Publicly, Collins smiled. She already knew his next question. Yes. She tapped the display, revealing dozens of tiny encrypted transmissions hidden inside routine weather telemetry, commercial freight updates, and astronomical observations. Privately, they have increased encrypted data traffic by almost 40%. Brooks slowly nodded. Exactly what I expected. Lieutenant Owen Parker stared at the screen. How can they hide military intelligence inside weather reports? Collins answered before Brooks could. Because nobody pays attention to weather reports. Owen let out a quiet breath. That is clever. Brooks folded the report and placed it on the table. No. Clever would be making us believe they stopped looking. They want us comfortable. Across the galaxy, Fleet Director Cashin Voran stood inside the observation deck of the Dravian flagship, while one of his senior analysts displayed a detailed holographic model of human space. Orbital stations, supply depots, Communications relays, emergency response routes, and shipping schedules floated above the table in remarkable detail. Our database is nearly complete, the analyst said proudly. We have identified their commercial infrastructure, civilian logistics, and military response estimates. Voren examined the projection with quiet satisfaction. Any indication they suspect the full extent of our survey? None. Their responses remain diplomatic. Their fleet posture has not changed. Voren nodded. Then humanity has accepted reality. Which reality, Director? The analyst asked. Voren smiled. That larger civilizations always gather information. Smaller civilizations learn to live with it. Back on Earth, Ambassador Laura Mitchell returned from another council session carrying the familiar expression Brooks had learned to recognize over the years. She entered his office without ceremony and dropped her travel case beside the door. Long week? Brooks asked. Laura laughed tiredly. Long speeches. Anything useful? One thing. Brooks waited. The Dravenian delegates have stopped asking questions. Brooks raised an eyebrow. That means they think they already have the answers. Laura nodded slowly. That is exactly what worried me. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Outside the office window, civilian shuttles crossed low orbit while school groups toured the International Space Station. Families went about ordinary lives without realizing how carefully that normal life was being protected. Laura looked toward the planet below. Do you ever wish they were wrong about us? She asked quietly. Brooks followed her gaze. Every day. Then why keep preparing? Brooks answered without hesitation. Because wishing has never stopped anyone from making a bad decision. 2 nights later, every senior commander on Earth received the same secure message. There was no dramatic language, no declaration of emergency, and no urgent demand for immediate action. It contained only 4 words followed by a timestamp. Operational Readiness Phase 1. Lieutenant Owen read the notification twice before looking at Collins. That is all. She slipped her tablet into her bag and stood. That is all. What happens now? Collins gave the kind of calm smile that experienced officers wore when they had practiced something for years without ever hoping to use it. Now, she said, we continue acting exactly the way the Dravians expect us to act. Across the stars, Fleet Director Cashin Voren looked over his completed intelligence files and quietly approved the next stage of his government's plan, completely unaware that the silence surrounding Earth had never been surrender. It had been permission for him to keep believing exactly what humanity wanted him to believe. The message reached every major government in the galaxy within the same hour. Civilian navigation systems refreshed automatically. Commercial shipping companies received updated route advisories. Insurance providers quietly amended their risk assessments. The notification itself contained only a single operational change. Effective immediately, all civilian traffic to the Sol system was temporarily suspended due to infrastructure maintenance. To most observers, it sounded routine. Temporary maintenance happened every week somewhere in the galaxy. Fleet Director Cashin Voren barely glanced at the report before handing it back to his operations officer. Convenient timing, the officer remarked. Perhaps they are finally upgrading those outdated defense satellites. Voren smiled. Or perhaps they realize someone has been watching. The officer looked concerned. Should we postpone the next phase? Voren shook his head. No. If anything, this confirms they are nervous. Nervous governments close borders. Confident governments leave them open. Thousands of light years away, Admiral Nathan Brooks stood inside Earth's Joint Command Center, watching one display after another transition from blue to gray. Civilian shipping lanes disappeared from the map. Tourist permits expired automatically. Commercial jump gates entered standby mode one by one without public announcement. No alarms sounded. No emergency broadcasts interrupted daily life. Schools remained open. Restaurants stayed full. Families still gathered for dinner. Only the people responsible for protecting Earth understood that the planet had quietly changed its posture overnight. Commander Rebecca Collins walked beside Brooks, reviewing the final checklist. Outer commercial corridors secured. She tapped another item. Private freight traffic redirected. Another tap. Scientific exchanges postponed. Brooks nodded after each update. Any public reaction? Minimal. Collins smiled slightly. Most people think the government is replacing navigation arrays. Brooks looked toward the enormous tactical display covering the wall. Good. Lieutenant Owen Parker entered carrying another status report. Sir, every scheduled departure has been rerouted except one diplomatic courier requesting direct access. Brooks accepted the file. Origin: Galactic Council. Brooks read the request carefully before handing it back. Approve the visit. Owen looked surprised. Even now, especially now. Less than 24 hours later, Ambassador Laura Mitchell welcomed Council Inspector Elias Rowan at Earth's orbital reception terminal. Rowan stepped off the shuttle carrying a small travel case and an expression that balanced professionalism with obvious curiosity. Ambassador, he said warmly, your maintenance project seems unusually comprehensive. Laura smiled politely. Safety upgrades tend to inconvenience everyone. Rowan glanced through the observation windows where dozens of docking ports now sat completely empty. I have visited this station many times. I have never seen it this quiet. Neither have I, Laura admitted. Rowan lowered his voice. Some delegates are beginning to speculate. About what? That Earth is preparing for something. Laura maintained the same relaxed expression she had perfected through years of diplomacy. Inspector, every government prepares for something. Hurricanes, solar storms, economic downturns. Responsible planning rarely makes interesting headlines. Rowan studied her face for several seconds before smiling. You always answer exactly enough. Laura laughed softly. Occupational hazard. After the meeting ended, Rowan filed a brief report to the council stating that human officials appeared calm, cooperative, and focused on domestic infrastructure improvements. Fleet Director Cashin Vorin read the report later that evening with quiet satisfaction. As expected, he told his advisors. No mobilization, no defensive alert, no political panic. One advisor pointed toward the latest reconnaissance summary. Their border is still closed. Vorin dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. Temporary caution. Nothing more. At almost the same moment, deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, Admiral Brooks entered a secure conference room where only a handful of senior leaders were waiting. There were no dramatic speeches, no emotional declarations. Brooks simply placed a thin folder on the center of the table. Across the front were 4 plain words that none of the younger officers had ever seen outside training simulations. Soul Gate authorization confirmed. The room remained completely silent until Brooks finally looked around the table and spoke in the same calm voice he used every ordinary morning. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, today we stop pretending that preparation and readiness are the same thing. From this moment forward, every hour matters. On the 12th day after the Soul Gate authorization was confirmed, Fleet Director Cashin Vorin made the decision that would later be studied in every military academy across the galaxy. It was not made in anger. It was not made under pressure. It was made because every report on his desk told the same reassuring story. Human borders were closed. Civilian traffic had disappeared. Trade had stopped. To Vorin, those were not signs of confidence. They were signs of fear. He stood at the center of the command deck, while dozens of senior officers waited for his orders. A holographic map of human space floated above the table, every survey route carefully marked from months of intelligence gathering. Our reconnaissance is complete, Vorin said calmly. We know their logistics network, their communication relays, and their orbital infrastructure. Their economy is isolated, their civilian routes are inactive, and their diplomatic activity has slowed. One younger commander looked at the display. Do you believe they expect us? Vorin smiled. They expect someone eventually. They do not expect us now. Another officer cleared his throat. There is still no official declaration from the council. There does not need to be, Vorin replied. This is an inspection of strategic stability. Nothing more. Across the bridge, nobody questioned him again. The fleet slowly adjusted course toward the edge of human territory. Hundreds of ships moved with practiced precision, maintaining perfect formation as they approached the invisible boundary surrounding the solar system. Back on Earth, Admiral Nathan Brooks received the first alert while eating breakfast alone in his office. Commander Rebecca Collins entered carrying a secure tablet but did not appear alarmed. She simply placed it beside his coffee mug. Brooks read the report in silence before taking another sip. They crossed the observation line, Collins said. Brooks nodded once. Exactly on schedule. Lieutenant Owen Parker hurried into the room a moment later. Unlike Collins, he could not hide his concern. Sir, Long-range sensors confirm a full Dravenian task force entering the outer approach corridor. Brooks looked at him calmly. How many ships? More than we predicted. Brooks folded the report and stood. No, he answered quietly. Exactly as many as we predicted. Owen frowned. Should we notify the council? Already done. Should we broadcast a warning? Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his uniform before answering. We already did. Months ago. Inside the Galactic Council chambers, Ambassador Laura Mitchell watched delegates react as updated navigation data appeared across the central display. Several representatives whispered to one another while Inspector Elias Rowan studied the changing map with growing concern. Those are Dravian fleet signatures, Rowan said. Laura nodded. Yes. They are entering restricted space. Yes. Rowan looked directly at her. Your government has not responded. Laura remained composed. Not publicly. The inspector stared for a long moment. Should I be worried? Laura answered with complete honesty. That depends. On what? On whether they are planning to turn around. Hundreds of millions of miles away, the leading elements of the Dravian formation crossed the final navigation marker recognized by civilian traffic control. Nothing happened. No warning beacons activated. No human patrol ships appeared. Space remained almost unnaturally quiet. One bridge officer smiled. Sir, their sensors have detected us, but there has been no interception. Another added, no defensive formations either. Vorin slowly folded his hands behind his back. You see? They understand the difference between courage and survival. Yet aboard every human command station, no voices were raised, no hurried orders echoed through crowded control rooms, and no panic spread through the ranks. Men and women quietly confirmed checklists they had rehearsed for years, speaking in calm voices while ordinary clocks continued ticking on the walls. Brooks entered the primary command center, looked once at the approaching fleet, and gave only a single instruction. Continue recording everything. Collins glanced toward him. Nothing else. Brooks looked at the display where the Dravian fleet continued its steady advance. Not yet, he said. The most important part of this operation is allowing them enough time to convince themselves they are still in control. The first surprise was not an explosion, a warning shot, or an emergency transmission. It was silence. Fleet Director Cassian Vorin stood on the bridge expecting human patrols to shadow his formation the moment it crossed the final approach corridor. Instead, every scanner reported the same impossible result. Civilian traffic was gone. Military traffic was gone. Even background communications had faded to almost nothing. One sensor officer looked up from his station. Director, I have never seen a populated system this quiet. Vorin remained calm. Electronic discipline. They are attempting to hide their movements. Should we increase active scans? No. Passive only. Let them believe we are still following survey protocols. Thousands of miles away, Admiral Nathan Brooks watched the same fleet through an entirely different set of sensors. Commander Rebecca Collins enlarged the tactical display. Hundreds of Dravian vessels appeared as bright blue markers drifting deeper into the carefully monitored corridor. Lieutenant Owen Parker leaned closer to the screen. Sir, they have entered every observation zone we prepared. Brooks nodded. Good. Owen hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering him for days. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Back at the academy, they taught us that the strongest defense is overwhelming firepower. But you have spent months letting them collect information, letting them move closer, and letting them think they understand us. What? Brooks looked around the command center where dozens of officers quietly monitored their stations without a trace of panic. Because fear teaches the wrong lesson. Owen frowned. Brooks continued. If we had chased them away on day one, they would have returned with a larger fleet. If we had threatened them publicly, they would have called it political theater. The only lesson they will remember is discovering their own assumptions were wrong. Collins smiled faintly. People rarely argue with their own mistakes. At almost the same moment, Ambassador Laura Mitchell addressed an emergency gathering inside the Galactic Council. Representatives from dozens of civilizations filled the chamber while updated navigation data rotated above the central platform. Inspector Elias Rowan stood beside her, reading the incoming reports with growing disbelief. Every communication relay inside human territory has gone dark, one delegate announced. Another representative added, commercial tracking confirms zero civilian movement. Murmurs spread across the chamber. One elderly ambassador finally looked toward Laura. What exactly is Earth doing? Laura answered in the same calm tone she had used through years of negotiations. Protecting its citizens. From what? Someone asked. She paused for only a moment. From unnecessary misunderstandings. The chamber fell unusually quiet. Back aboard the Dravenian flagship, technicians continued comparing their reconnaissance database against real-time observations. Something no longer matched. Supply depots that should have been busy appeared empty. Communication satellites they had carefully mapped no longer transmitted recognizable traffic. Even the orbital stations they believed they understood seemed to operate according to completely different patterns. Director, the chief analyst said cautiously, our predictive models are becoming unreliable. Vorin folded his arms. Explain. The infrastructure we documented over the last several months does not behave the way we expected. Meaning, the analyst swallowed. It almost feels as though we were studying a public version of their system. Vorin looked at the display for several long seconds before answering. Impossible. The analyst nodded slowly. That is what I thought too. Deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, Brooks received the latest intelligence update. He read it once before placing the report face down on the table. Collins looked at him. Well, Brooks allowed himself the smallest smile anyone in the room had ever seen. They finally noticed. Owen looked confused. Noticed what? Brooks looked toward the giant map of the solar system glowing quietly across the wall. That everything they spent months studying was exactly what we wanted the rest of the galaxy to see. They were never looking at our real defensive network. They were looking at the version we built for observers. A slow silence settled across the command center as the meaning of those words reached every officer in the room. For the first time since the operation began, humanity was no longer waiting for the next move. The next move belonged to the Dravians, and they were about to make it based on a map that had never been true. Fleet Director Cassian Vorin had spent his entire career believing that superior intelligence always defeated superior numbers. Now, for the first time, he questioned the information sitting in front of him instead of the enemy beyond it. Every projection generated by the fleet computers disagreed with reality. Supply routes appeared where no cargo ships traveled. Communication hubs they expected to intercept remained completely silent. Even gravitational traffic patterns looked strangely artificial. His chief analyst slowly looked up from the console. Director, I recommend we halt the advance until we verify our database. Vorin stared at the glowing map. How long? Perhaps 48 hours. Another officer spoke before Vorin could answer. Respectfully, every hour we wait gives humanity more time to reorganize. Vorin considered both arguments before making his decision. Maintain our position. Passive observation only. It was the first time in weeks that the Dravian fleet had stopped moving. Deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, Admiral Nathan Brooks noticed the change almost immediately. Commander Rebecca Collins smiled as the tactical display froze. They finally hit the wall. Brooks folded his hands behind his back. Not a wall. Collins looked toward him. A question. Brooks nodded. The most dangerous battlefield is the one inside a commander's mind. Right now Vorin no longer trusts his own intelligence. Lieutenant Owen Parker studied the display. So we are not defeating their fleet. Brooks answered quietly. We are defeating their confidence. Meanwhile, inside the Galactic Council, emergency consultations had become almost continuous. Delegates who had ignored humanity for years suddenly requested private meetings with Ambassador Laura Mitchell. Inspector Elias Rowan found her standing alone outside the council chamber, looking through a massive observation window at the stars. You look surprisingly calm, Rowan said. Laura smiled gently. That is because I know my people. Rowan crossed his arms. Then tell me something honestly. Is Earth preparing for war? Laura shook her head. No. Rowan blinked. No. Earth prepared a very long time ago. He looked at her carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration, but found none. Then why does everyone suddenly feel like we have misunderstood humanity? Laura looked toward the distant stars before answering. Because for decades, everyone believed human restraint came from weakness. She paused. Nobody ever considered that restraint might simply be a choice. Those words spread through the council faster than any official statement. Within hours, shipping companies voluntarily expanded their exclusion zones around human territory. Exploration guilds quietly canceled survey contracts near the solar system. Insurance corporations doubled premiums for any vessel requesting routes close to Sol. No government ordered those changes. No human diplomat demanded them. Civilian organizations simply watched the uncertainty growing around the Dravenian expedition and made their own calculations. Back aboard the flagship, Vorin received another update. Director, commercial traffic throughout nearby sectors has begun rerouting away from human space. He frowned. Why? There has been no official explanation. Another officer added, even independent traders are avoiding the region. Vorin walked toward the bridge viewport. Outside, the stars remained peaceful. Nothing threatened his fleet. Nothing challenged his authority. Yet something invisible had changed. The galaxy itself was quietly stepping backward. People do not abandon profitable trade routes without a reason, he murmured. His analyst answered carefully. Perhaps they know something we do not. For the first time since entering human space, Vorin did not immediately dismiss the possibility. Back on Earth, Brooks received reports showing civilian rerouting spreading across neighboring sectors without a single human request. Owen looked at the incoming data in disbelief. We did not ask anyone to stay away. Brooks nodded. Exactly. Then why are they leaving? Brooks watched the expanding safety buffer appear around the solar system. Because fear imposed by force eventually disappears. He looked once more at the growing, empty space surrounding Earth. But caution reached through experience becomes tradition. And traditions last much longer than fleets. 30 years later, Cadet Mason Carter stood beside Captain Daniel Mercer on the bridge of the Horizon Crossing, still staring at the small yellow star that every navigation system quietly avoided. The silence between them felt different now. It was no longer filled with mystery. It was filled with understanding. So that is how it ended, Mason said softly. Mercer gave a slow shake of his head. No. Mason looked surprised. It did not. The old captain smiled faintly. The interesting part was never how it ended. It was what happened afterward. He reached toward the navigation display, where a permanent circle surrounded the solar system. The Dravenian fleet eventually turned around. Mason blinked. Without a battle? Without one. Why? Mercer folded his arms. Because their commander finally understood something that every experienced captain learns sooner or later. When every piece of intelligence suddenly stops making sense, the smartest decision is not to keep moving forward. It is to stop pretending you know where you are. Historical records later described the event with polite, diplomatic language. The Council called it a strategic de-escalation. The Dravenian Empire called it a navigational reassessment. Historians invented long technical explanations filled with charts and political theories. None of those explanations captured what actually changed that week. What changed was trust. The galaxy stopped trusting its assumptions about humanity. Fleet Director Cassian Vorin quietly retired less than 2 years later. During his final lecture at the Imperial War College, one young officer asked him whether humanity possessed the most advanced military technology in known space. Vorin thought for a long moment before answering. I do not know, he admitted. Because we never truly saw it. The classroom became silent. Then why did we leave? Another student asked. Vorin looked out the window before speaking. Because I finally realized that every conclusion I reached had been based on information my opponent had willingly allowed me to collect. If someone lets you believe exactly what you want to believe, you should start asking yourself who is really leading the conversation. Those words eventually became required reading in military academies across dozens of civilizations. Meanwhile, life inside the solar system quietly returned to normal. Children still walked to school. Families still gathered for weekend barbecues. Engineers still argued over deadlines. Farmers still worried about the weather. Tourists still filled beaches every summer. Humanity never celebrated becoming a legend because that had never been the goal. Admiral Nathan Brooks retired the following spring. During his final day at Orbital Command, Lieutenant Owen Parker walked him to the shuttle bay. Sir, Owen asked, after everything that happened, what are you most proud of? Brooks smiled as he looked back one last time at the command center he had spent so many years protecting. That most people will never know how close they came to losing an ordinary Tuesday. Owen laughed quietly before realizing Brooks had not been joking. The shuttle doors closed behind the old admiral, and he disappeared into civilian life without ceremony. Captain Mercer finished the story and rested one hand on the bridge railing. The horizon crossing continued along its revised course, leaving the distant yellow star behind. Mason remained silent until the navigation computer announced that they had safely cleared the exclusion boundary. "Captain," he finally said, "do you think humanity is the strongest civilization in the galaxy?" Mercer looked through the stars for several seconds before answering. "Strength is easy to misunderstand. The strongest person in the room is usually not the one talking about it." He glanced once more toward the distant light of Sol. "The galaxy does not avoid that star because humans taught everyone to be afraid. It stays away because humanity taught everyone something far more valuable. Never mistake kindness for inability, patience for surrender, or quiet people for powerless ones. Some borders exist to keep danger out. The wisest ones exist to keep unnecessary tragedy from ever walking in."